What do public spaces do for you? When you think about spending time outside in a park, at an outdoor market, or on the street, what do those places really do for you? Do they give you time to people watch, be in nature, shop with local entrepreneurs? When they're well designed and well managed, public spaces like these provide the social infrastructure that keep our cities alive and make our communities feel like home. At their best, they give us a chance to meet our neighbors, provide space for demonstrations, boost health, embrace and foster equity, and offer us peace of mind and fresh air. But what if they could do more? Now, I'm not an urban planner. My background is in climate change, specifically how it impacts people and policy. So a few years ago, when I started a job at a nonprofit called Project for Public Spaces, it was a bit of a change for me to go from working on urban sustainability to thinking about things like design details in public parks. This transition was one that would make me think differently about the way people live in and move through their communities. I would learn a lot about how a process called placemaking helps communities to make their vision for their public spaces a reality, and about how tightly these things can be linked to our changing climate if you look closely enough. Suddenly, I was frustrated at all the missed opportunities I saw in public spaces everywhere I went. Parks that weren't accessible, or didn't really serve the communities that needed them most. My eyes were suddenly opened to the ways that, depending on how they're managed, used, or built, our parks and our streets can either support us in solving shared problems or worsen them. As I learned more about the crucial importance of public spaces in the fabric of today's cities, I began to see how important even our smallest parks are in solving larger societal problems like climate change. An example of this that really drove the point home to me was Hurricane Harvey, when Houston's Baker Ripley Community Center was mobilized in disaster recovery. Precisely because it is such a hub of community services in normal times, it made it possible for people to coordinate volunteer and emergency service efforts when the city was flooded by the hurricane. After learning about this example, I started to think about where climate and the public realm could intersect. Of course, many people are already talking about the ways that our urban environment can be adapted to climate change. But these conversations are all too often dominated by ideas like seawalls or flood prevention, and other sorts of physical resilience building efforts. These so-called prevent and predict approaches all too often leave real people to the wayside. But on our worst days, we all know that it's people who help each other to recover. We've seen this time and again when people brave flooded streets to evacuate their neighbors during a hurricane, or help each other to rebuild homes after a natural disaster strikes. This means that we're missing a link here: social resilience. Social resilience is widely considered to be our ability to respond to a challenge. It's based on social cohesion, which has a lot to do with attachment to a place, connections with other people, and shared values. All things that a good public space can support. So why can't we do both? Wrap physical and social resilience all into one place? I'd argue that public spaces are uniquely positioned to lay the foundation for both physical and social resilience. We can certainly design them to absorb excess rainwater or provide shade, but we can also make sure that they're the places that we go to meet our neighbors and build up our social safety net of trusted folks. The question is how to balance the two. How to create a space that absorbs or resists the physical hazards of climate, that's also a fun and welcoming place that supports social cohesion. How do we avoid wasting the opportunity that our parks, streets, and plazas provide to not only physically weather the shocks of the climate crisis, but to do so in ways that build off of strong social ties? First, I think we can look to places like Rotterdam, a city that's doing climate adaptation a little differently. In Rotterdam, a concept called a water square has been made into official policy under Rotterdam's Water Plan 2. Now, what is a water square? The water square concept was developed by local architects at De Urbanisten, and it's basically a public space that serves a second function as a stormwater management feature, designed to flood and collect water on days of heavy precipitation. Waterplein Benthemplein is one of such water squares. The Benthemplein Water Square has 3 large basins and a series of gutters and drainage features embedded into the plaza. But beyond collecting rainwater, Waterplein Benthemplein is designed for multiple social uses. One basin is great for skateboarding, another is designed for basketball or other team sports, and the third serves the surrounding schools, fitness centers, and churches as a gathering space. This summer, I studied the square and eventually visited, sitting there for hours to observe not only how the space looks and functions physically, but also how it performs on a social scale. I watched how people moved through the space, whether they stopped and lingered or just passed through. I watched how different age groups navigated the park and heard their dislikes and likes about the space. I also spoke to the folks who design the square, as well as those who clean and maintain it on a daily basis, and the city officials who wrote the local adaptation policies that made it possible. The Bentham Water Square is a gathering place, primarily used by students and people visiting the institutions that surround it. Over the course of my visits, I noticed that it was often used as a through space for people walking or cycling, particularly people visiting the fitness center. Skaters also used the space, but found it limited in how many obstacles it had for them to grind their skateboards on, and they complained about things like broken glass and garbage. Nonetheless, the space offers lots of different types of places to sit, to gather, or to exercise. Here's what I think communities from around the world can learn from this water square. First off, you don't have to completely redesign a space or go fully high-tech. Though the water square model relies on many mechanical systems that helped it to manage stormwater runoff, climate adaptation doesn't always have to look that way. Volunteer events to depave a space or the addition of greenery on your street, these are also climate adaptation. To that end, the city of Rotterdam supports locals with supplies and innovative grants to do things like turn paved areas into green spaces. Secondly, adaptation at the expense of accessibility isn't adaptation. Don't let climate-proofing features make a space inaccessible. Just like in any other public space, if it doesn't work well for everyone, it doesn't work, period. Sometimes physical features like rain gutters or steps can make access difficult for differently abled people. A resilient space is, first and foremost, a public space, so making sure that foundational values like accessibility for everyone are kept in mind is the most important starting point. Next, resilient public spaces mean creating a new type of management plan. The water square is a unique maintenance strategy. It's got a different cleaning schedule than other squares, and maintenance teams who work there on a daily basis have adapted their techniques and tools to fit the square and its technical specifications. Another takeaway is that true resilience requires iteration and learning. A learning-oriented and evolving approach is a surefire sign of a project that cultivates social resilience. The Waterplan Bentham was a pilot project, and as I've mentioned, it has a lot of mechanical features to pump surface water. But since its construction, the city has continued to learn from the square. Now, new water squares are built differently, relying less on mechanical features and more on gravity to move captured water. It's also easy to get too narrowly focused when it comes to climate hazards, but we really do have to address multiple issues at once. It's easy to miss less visible things like heat stress or access to shade. For example, the water square design was almost entirely based on water management priorities, and risks like heat were not a particular area of focus. But now, heat is coming to be a larger part of Rotterdam's adaptation plans, which leads me to my next point. Resilience planning requires collaboration across disciplines and across teams. Rotterdam is currently working on a heat plan, championed mostly by the Public Health Department, but also heavily involving folks in the city management team who work on climate adaptation strategy. Another thing to consider is that it's often more effective to nest resilience goals with other broader city-level goals. Perhaps because Rotterdam faces so many hydrological risks, climate adaptations in Rotterdam are housed within the water department. But beyond that, Rotterdam's resilience and adaptation goals are combined with things like tourism, attraction of talent, greening and beautification, and now even COVID recovery. In early 2020, a set of 7 public space projects aimed at greening and COVID-sensitive social distancing adjustments were announced. Another thing to remember is that it's important to make sure that community engagement happens meaningfully from the outset and continues long after the project is finished. True placemaking, as noted by experts like Fred Kent, draws out the expertise that the community already has, not just filling in the gaps on a preconceived design or function, rather getting in touch with the community's vision from the start. It's also key to partner wisely and fund nonprofit programs that truly know what's happening at the street level. Nonprofits can often be better at building up grassroots initiatives to get projects implemented than municipalities are. Collaborating with nonprofits not only as implementers, but as people who can shape policy and design is key. All of these recommendations are to say that taking people into account means that we have a more comprehensive view of what resilience really means. If we keep that in mind, we'll be better prepared as our cities and communities continue to come face to face with the climate crisis, not only in terms of public space, but generally. Now, Rotterdam is by no means the only city working on combining resilience and public space. Cities like Bangkok, New York City, and Toronto, among many others, are taking this approach as well. Now is our chance to learn from these innovators in the realm of resilient public spaces. So whether you're a city maker, urban planner, public space enthusiast, or even just someone who sometimes goes to the park, I hope you can see just how much our public spaces can do for us in an era of climate change.